this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the value of truth, and especially the question of whether or not truth is valuable and what kind of value it is. But I thought that we should start perhaps with something a bit softer, more anecdotal. And perhaps we can start with Katja. How have you personally or professionally grappled with this question and its potential responses?
Well, thanks first for having me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And thank you, Jonathan, for the kind introduction. Well, personally, I think, maybe I started to think about this in fairly typical ways. Like when you're young, you encounter disagreement, let's say in your family, you don't agree with your parents on this or that, but you love them and you don't want to end up, parting ways with people. And so if you are in a disagreement that seems to just be irresolvable, to persist, and you're quite committed that somehow, you have the truth, you have something to say here that is somehow more insightful than what the other person says, then, and the other person unfortunately takes the same stance, what are you going to do? If you don't want to part ways, it can sometimes seem that the only thing to do is to embrace relativism and say, well, maybe we are both right. But I guess I just always felt that is like a facile answer, that just cannot be the answer, because it simply doesn't make sense for two contradictories to be true. And today I would put all of this in more technical terms, but I guess that is how it first came up for me when I was like many, many, many years younger. So at that point, I guess then what are your options? Either you just continue to fight, which seemed unattractive, or you embrace relativism, or you find some third route. And I guess for me, the third route has always been to kind of take seriously the option that maybe we are both wrong or only partially right, and that really what we need is some kind of continued inquiry. So the kinds of philosophies that I'm taking a lot of interest in are in some sense inspired by either Socrates or ancient skepticism or those kinds of philosophies which say, well, the big questions are hard, like deal with it. So there are not going to be these quick answers. But that's okay, because in a way, you can devote your life to finding these answers. And so you can sort of make peace with the other person for now and just say, well, we will both think more about it. And maybe we can even think more about it together.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's so much to delve in there. I just send it over to Meghan, perhaps for her response first, and then we can discuss.
Yeah, I think there's some of my experiences similar to Katja's. This question of the value of truth, I didn't know how to express it as under that guise until I was well into philosophy grad school, but it has bothered me since I was probably 18, 19 years old. When I was in high school, I was a very good student, and I always wanted to get the right answer, and I would work really hard to get to the right answer. I remember I did the IB program, and we had this take-home math exam where it was this really difficult multi-step calculus problem involving planes landing and taking off. And it was really hard. And I just remember the joy I had in working so hard every night of a week to get to all of the right answers on this calculus exam. And what I realized about myself is I really want to know. And then I got to college. I started college when the September 11th attacks happened, and I started getting really interested in philosophy at that part of my life. And I remember this question kept occurring to me of, I want to know what a good life is. I've been told to care about that by my philosophy teachers. I want to know what real happiness is, and I don't want to waste my life going after things that are fake happiness. But then I started to have this worry, what if you discover the answers to these philosophical questions, the truth about things like why we're here and what we owe to each other, and the answer is horrible? Getting the answer to the math problem in high school was awesome. I got an A. I felt really smart. But what if we just we do a lot of philosophy and we think really hard, and we end up realizing that our lives are utterly meaningless and we've just been mistaken about everything that we've cared about. And philosophy holds out that answer of the truth being potentially disappointing or sad or scary when you uncover it. And I feel like I have spent a fair bit of my life as a graduate student and now as a philosophy professor, wrestling with that question. Like, why are we so confident that, we get driven to want to know the truth about these questions, and we can understand the problems and we want the answers. But why are we so confident that the answers to some of these philosophical questions are going to end up with happiness or with things that are really valuable to us rather than things that are like terrifying? And that I think that's one of the things that keeps me in philosophy, is actually the kind of excitement or risk of thinking like, man, we might get to the bottom of this and discover something about ourselves that we really never suspected. But it's a tough question. Skepticism for that reason seems to me is like that's my backup plan if I start to get too scared.
Thanks so much. And I was wondering if you have any comments or perhaps a diagnosis of perhaps the broader cultural views of the value of truth. So outside perhaps of those who are going into philosophy, who will be in the academy for most of their lives, have you sensed any sort of shift in the way in which truth is viewed more broadly in culture? And maybe even, I guess we can start with Katja again, maybe even if you can see any parallels from the discussions that happen in ancient philosophy, if there are such things.
Yeah, interesting question. Thank you. I want to first say something to Meghan, if that's okay. I understand what you say when you say skepticism is your backup plan. The kind of skepticism that I think is attractive is, and in a sense that already goes to Jonathan's question about, ancient options here. The kind of skepticism that I like really takes seriously that the Greek word skepsis means inquiry. It doesn't mean, doubting the world, doubting whether you have any true beliefs or anything like that. It means a kind of commitment to ongoing inquiry. And I think if I hear you talk about your own work and experience in philosophy, I almost wonder whether that could be more than a backup plan. Why couldn't that be in and of itself a pretty good life? And I think I've just come to think, and I share this sort of sense that, well, philosophy comes with a risk, because you open these questions, you ask questions presumably with an open mind. So maybe you don't like the answer, but I guess I'm just convinced somehow that the questions we are asking are really, really big. And I think given my own view of what we do in philosophy, they are also not, as it were, separate philosophical questions, but they are intertwined with questions in science, because ultimately I think we want to understand the world. And we can't do that alone, as it were. We cannot just do that as philosophers. We have to do that together with people in a lot of disciplines. And I think from that point of view, to me, it's like the fun of the risk is there, yes, but I see it maybe more positively. I see it as a kind of adventure of joint inquiry, where it's quite all right that we don't have the full answers now. Just simply given the size of the questions and the size of the project of trying to understand the world and how to live in it, yeah, sure, that is going to be a long-term thing. It's going to involve often finding out that one wasn't totally right, that one needs to start again, that one needs another model, one needs another conversation with yet another colleague, whatever. But anyway, if it's okay, Jonathan, I wanted to ask Meghan whether that is an okay version of skepticism for her.
Yeah, I think so. What's the term? So if we understand skepticism as being like this kind of ancient form of skepticism as being this commitment to never-ending inquiry or relentless inquiry, what's the term for the opposite way of life, for the one where you're just like, I'm not opening that box. Like, I don't want to look in there. Dogmatism, fair enough. So dogmatism is my backup plan. Right now I'm quite confident right now that inquiry, despite all of its like stresses and uncertainty and fits and starts, is going to lead somewhere better than the current condition that I'm in. But I'm also always a little bit nervous that it's not. And there is a bit of like, danger and faith and risk into continuing to push on these questions. And so, if, there's also this question. I don't know what you think about this, or either Jonathan or Katja, you think about this, but like dogmatism sometimes looks attractive. If you think, my gosh, I keep asking these questions and the answers I'm getting back are frustrating or really challenging things that I value. But yeah, dogmatism is my plan B.
Good. Jonathan, I'm sorry I didn't fully reply to your answer to your question. So, I mean, do I think that something has changed, I don't know, culturally with respect to truth? Yes, of course. I mean, in many obvious ways, like with people have realized that in so many political contexts, people have realized that we kind of all really care about the truth. And that could be truth about just particular things, like, what precisely is reported about this or that event in the news. And we don't want some version. We want to know, we want information. And by information, we mean something that is true. And I think it's also clear, I don't know, let's say when we think about research on vaccines for COVID, well, of course, we want the researchers to find out like what we can best do. And we care about the truth in science, where, let's say, medicine is, or epidemiology is one of the sciences. We care about truth partly because it directly bears on our life, and we are not interested in basing our actions on some, whatever. We want to act as well as we can because this is our life. So I guess what I'm saying is that maybe in that respect, I'm very influenced by ancient philosophy. For me, philosophy is not at all separate from science. In particular, the natural sciences, the sciences that what we call life sciences today, also study of the environment, climate science, and so on. I think we desperately need to find out what to do in so many contexts. And, how are we going to do that without a commitment to finding the truth, even if at the given point we only have as much as we have at a given point, and we need to base our actions on very often preliminary studies and so on and so forth. But of course, we totally care. And I think that's been abundantly clear, even more so recently. We totally care that these studies are as good as they can be.
Your response, Megan, or perhaps any questions in that response?
Yeah, I'm interested, Katja, what you think about this. When I've been teaching the Republic ever since I started teaching philosophy, but the last few years, I've approached it in a very different vein. Like I used to teach Plato's Republic as, Plato is paranoid about other people and paranoid about poetry and how we speak to each other. And the guy just really needs to relax and be a little bit more open-minded about how great our social life could be. Because remember, Plato's very has this pretty strict vision of the kind of city and world that we need to set up in order to have something like the truth. And I used to think it was wild and taught him as this kind of crazy utopian thinker. And then especially since the 2016 election and talking to my students about political life and democratic life, started teaching Plato much more seriously as issuing us really important warnings that we need to listen to. Not that we should start an authoritarian government ruled by philosopher kings or anything like that, but this idea that in a society like ours where people need to persuade each other, where communication is really highly valued and communication skills are really important, truth can be weaponized as a form of, or truth talk can be weaponized quickly and kind of under our noses in ways that could really undermine our ability to live together and be happy. And we see this, I think, with debates about COVID. To go back to Katja's point, you Google the real truth about COVID or the truth about COVID-19, you're not going to find truth-seeking scientific web pages, at least not the first 20 hits. Instead, they're going to be sites that are people trying to persuade you of things that have nothing to do with the truth. They're trying to sell you a crystal that'll cure COVID, or they're trying to convince you to vote a certain way that has nothing to do with treating people for a public health disaster. And in a kind of communications focused culture, democratic culture like ours, it's very easy for truth to become just this tool of persuasion and rhetoric, and for us to get so distracted by that we forget that the real truth, the philosophical truth, is something that's really difficult to attain, that requires a great deal of humility, and that, you know, our social system might not be set up to help us pursue. So I think it's gotten harder. I talked to my colleagues in history. Like, I've got a great colleague who works on early American history, like the early Republic, late 1700s. And she's like, oh no, it was way worse back then. Like, you think the internet's bad? You should see newspapers from like the 1790s. Those were a total disaster. So I'm open to historians correcting me on, like, we live in a tough time for truth. But I think we do live in a tough time for truth, at least the last few years, especially.
It's interesting what you say about teaching the Republic. And, you know, I guess it is not a surprise that I love the Republic and I love to teach it. I think that the kinds of social dynamics that Plato is describing, for example, in books 8 and 9, where we have this kind of decline from one state of things to the next, driven by excessive love of money. Well, you know, how is all of this not recognizable? And it is I know, of course, what you mean when evidently the Republic can come across as like, this is totally not what we want. You know, I agree. But depending on how you approach it, it can also seem like, wow, those are dynamics that we see in our own society, and a society that is wedded to values which have like nothing to do with the truth or with justice or anything like this is on a kind of decline that is disastrous. And that is also a kind of almost like a downward spiraling, which is at some point out of control. So I think that is what we get in books 8 and 9. I think it is like one of the most like insightful political texts in our tradition. Another thing that I really love about the Republic is there is a distinction early on between lying in words and lying in the soul. And Plato thinks that even though some of us love to tell these like little lies once in a while, he thinks that none of us wants to have falsehoods in the soul. And I think what he means here, what he's saying is, it's a disputed question among scholars, but one of the things he seems to be saying is that there are some things where we just inherently care about the truth, normative questions about what is good and bad for human beings, and maybe also questions about divinity, where, you know, even if maybe sometimes a quick white lie about have you done the homework or whatever, maybe that doesn't seem so terrible. But this other kind of lying to yourself about some of these weighty normative things, he thinks that none of us wants that. And I've always found that a really interesting thought. I wonder whether that's something that you have taught when you talk about the Republic.
Yeah, when we think about the end of the Republic, Plato talks about the person with the democratic soul, and he doesn't mean that in a nice way. It's the democratic souled man, and, you know, on Monday he's playing the flute, and on Tuesday he's doing philosophy, and on Wednesday he's entering politics, and on Thursday he's on a diet, and on Friday he's totally drunk. And he's just every day he's kind of changing a new thing that he's going after or obsessed with, and probably pushing on other people in the case of the politics and philosophy. And you get this depiction of this person who's just shifting around, whichever way the wind seems to be blowing. And Plato doesn't hold this man in very high regard, obviously. But you look at, your face. I don't know if you're on Facebook, Katja, but like I look at my Facebook feed half the time and I'm like, oh my gosh, I've become the democratic souled woman. Like, today I'm up in arms about this thing I just read in the Atlantic. And then tomorrow I'm showing you pictures of this sandwich I made. And is there kind of nothing kind of constant that I love and tend to in my life that's kind of running through everything? And I think Plato also has this just really beautiful diagnosis of for us to feel like we're genuinely happy and settled, we have to be getting out of the cave. We have to be somehow finding a deeper desire that's more constant against all of these things that are pushed on us to want.
Yeah, thanks so much for that exchange. I'd like to briefly shift gears just a little bit before moving on to questions of the grounds of truth or the value of truth. And I think a lot of students care a lot about disagreement and how that bears on the value of truth, or vice versa, perhaps more aptly. And whether or not, and I use these terms loosely here, whether or not there are just or unjust or virtuous or unvirtuous ways of convincing others of truth, if we agree that there is this preeminence to truth that sort of drives skepsis, or maybe for the dogmatists, it drives them sticking to the dogmas. If there is this preeminence, right? What exactly are the justified means here? Do we have duties to others for those sorts of things, and how do we see that in culture?
I can start off. I got really frustrated over Thanksgiving. I was reading the New York Times, and I love Adam Grant. He's this business professor at Wharton, and he does a lot of popular writing about psychology. He's a psychologist, and he wrote this very well-meaning article in the New York Times about you're getting ready to spend Thanksgiving with your family, and it's been a while, and you're going to encounter people with different political views from you. Here's how to engage with them. And so I'm reading this, I totally have these people in my family. I'm very, very ready for this advice. But his advice was using research from social psychology about how to ask people investigative questions to get them to trust you so that you can start to give them the message that you hope that they'll listen to. So Katja turns out to be my aunt who's skeptical of the COVID vaccine or has a different political persuasion than I do. In the before times, I might come in and just want to argue with her and be like, look, I've prepared 4 facts about why you're wrong. And Grant says that's the wrong way to approach it. Instead, come in with some questions to kind of warm your aunt up. And then as you're asking the question, start subtly getting her to appreciate that there might be a better view, namely your view that she could come around to. And this method tends to be far more effective at getting people to change their minds, which is what Grant was trying to to convince the New York Times readers of. And I'm reading this, and of course I'm teaching Plato the same week and up here at Notre Dame, and I'm just thinking this is peak sophistry. Coming in and using questions, knowing exactly the outcome you already want the person to arrive at, which is whatever your view is. I just want to use questions to convince Katja to agree with me, rather than coming into this conversation or questioning session thinking that there's something independent of each of us, like the truth that we might be able to get at together. And gosh, I was also thinking what happens if my aunt has read the same Adam Grant article and is doing the same kind of subtle questioning method on me? Am I going to end up with a worse view because I participated in this conversation? But I think that we really do need to check our intentions when we come into these kind of truth-seeking conversations in disagreement, and really make sure that we're in a position where we were seeking the truth rather than just a more subtle or sophisticated form of power over another person. And even really well-meaning ethical people can, at the end of the day, just want to control other people and not care about the truth, I think.
I agree. I was recently at a conference on disagreement where someone was wearing a T-shirt which said, "If I were to agree with you, we would both be wrong." And I think that's just sort of not the way. I mean, he was of course making fun of this, and I thought it was hilarious. But I think that's just sort of not the way to go into these conversations. If you just sort of presume, kind of from the get-go, that the other person is wrong, and any kind of step in their direction would only be a worsening of your own views. How is that going to be a conversation? So I guess, in a sense, I can only reiterate what Meghan just said. I think coming into a conversation with some kind of epistemic modesty, humility, whatever you want to call it, and being open to listen and to be, to inquire together. Now, of course, there are sometimes things where we feel that, people who are saying that they don't know something, they are just lying. I mean, a famous example is that, I don't know, tobacco companies in the 70s, at some point when people were saying, well, we do not know that smoking cigarettes is harmful for your health. I think there are examples where you just want to say, I'm sorry, but you do know this, and you have a strategy here that I hope you can get rid of. But I think for most questions that have something to do with how we should live, there are going to be complex questions, and there are going to be further arguments to listen to, and there is going to be an opportunity when we just want to know more about what the other person thinks.
And this actually, to your comment earlier, Katja, about lying in your soul, or this idea that, we can't live for very long with just this like forming our lives around things that we know to be false. I think here is another topic where Plato actually gives us some good advice that we should take to heart. Plato famously diverges. Socrates thought you could cure people through questions and conversation. He was so optimistic. At least if you're taking Socrates at his word, he thinks conversation can move people. But Plato is a little bit more realistic, that some folks are really committed to the lie, or really stuck in a dark place. And for them, one of the best things you can do is not necessarily try to argue somebody into a new position, but instead just show them a better example of something that's better. Like, people need to perceive a better way of life. I think this totally happened with smoking, as you could have 80 million studies and fights and congressional hearings about the tobacco industry, and that didn't really move the needle nearly as much as just kind of showing people a healthy way that they could live out their adult lives that didn't have this as a component of it. And I think one of the most important things we can do to kind of, as philosophers, to inculcate a love of truth in others is to just show people like the good aspects of a life that's committed to this, that it's not a life of just interminable argument and frustration, but it's a life that's got like things that are available to it that are really meaningful and wonderful that you wouldn't have if you're just willing to like stay totally entrapped by the lie.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks so much. And I hope that people will have follow-up questions about all of that, because of course it's so rich. So just to remind people, in the suggest tab, you can ask questions. They'll be sent to me, and then I can ask Katja and Meghan about those things. But I guess for the end here, I'd like to shift to perhaps the ground or the origins, in maybe a temporal sense, of this value of truth, and what exactly sufficient or satisfactory explanations might be. And I explicitly would like to connect this to whether or not there's some privileged place for religious explanations, or whether or not we don't need those types of explanations. So I'd like to start with Meghan on this one this time.
I'll preface this. So I am a religious person. I'm a Catholic Christian, and very thoughtful one that tries to do philosophy about her own Christianity all the time, sometimes with good results and sometimes with disastrous results. But one thing I'll say to the humility point that we've been talking about through this whole conversation is sometimes the people that are in my camp on this, Christians and Catholics in particular, are very bad examples of caring about the truth in conversations. Like, they are really out to kind of exert power over people who disagree with them, or are not willing to kind of take on the risk of asking the difficult questions about the things that really matter to them. And I when I'm talking to other Christians about this topic, I do really encourage them to read the Republic, and to be courageous in the things that they say that really matter to them. And courage also means being willing to question, and means being open to really deeply listening to people who really disagree with you. That said, for me, and in my life as a philosopher, one of the ways that I've given myself the confidence to go after some of these really hard questions in moral philosophy or in metaphysics is by having faith that God is going to meet me at the end of it, that like there is the whatever the truth is that I'm ultimately seeking after, it's good. And that for me is a bit of it's an article of faith. That's part of my, my religion kind of feeds into that faith and that way of life, in a way that gives me the confidence to keep doing philosophy. And just speaking about, from a point of self-knowledge and reflection, if I didn't have that, I don't know if I would have the courage to ask some of the philosophical questions that I go after. So I think that, that I don't mean for that to say that philosophers who don't share a kind of Christian way of life or religious way of life don't have other resources that they can tap for explaining why they love philosophy so much. But I think for Christians who are interested in philosophy, the faith ends up being a battery for the work in a way that's really helpful and kind of can sustain them over long periods of time.
Katja, do you have a response or questions, perhaps? Or
yeah, that is super interesting. I will just, I will speak from the perspective of an ancient philosopher, even though, though I'm so much older than the students. I hope I'm not that ancient, but I am very much, my perspective has been shaped quite a bit by, in effect now, I don't know, spending 25 years or more thinking about ancient philosophy. And ancient philosophy is, of course, different from a lot of later philosophy insofar as it is not monotheistic in the sense that, I don't know, let's say Descartes or Kant or many of the kind of towering figures and also, interesting scholastic authors, women authors who are now being rediscovered from medieval, early modern ages. For those thinkers, a monotheistic worldview was more or less framing philosophy. And in ancient philosophy, that's just not the case. And of course, that makes a big difference. Now, I guess I'm maybe I've just embraced that at an early age, but I am on board with the Socratic idea that the search for knowledge or search for truth is a kind of care for the soul, and that the soul is somehow the worthiest thing about us. Today we might not say soul, we might say mind, or, whatever precisely we would say, I think doesn't really touch the kind of basic idea here. But the thought is that, what kinds of mental states you have, what you think, what you feel, how you relate to the world, how you relate to other people, that's super important. And that is from this kind of point of view of I think all the ancient philosophers are on board with this. They think that, how you don't need any kind of deeper ground for inquiry into what the world is, like what is nature, what is human nature, how should we relate to nature, how should we relate to other human beings. We don't need a deeper ground for that. Other than that, it's kind of our job to lead good lives in this world. So we better kind of try and figure out how to do that. Now, does that mean that divinity doesn't have a role in that kind of picture? No. Part of it is that, of course, there's then the question whether the soul has some kind of dimensions which constitute a connection to divinity. For example, Aristotle thinks that our best kinds of thinking are, in fact, something we kind of almost share with divinity, there is a kind of thinking that is where we at least try to supersede human nature and get closer to divinity. And of course, there is also the thought that maybe part of what we need to understand about the world we live in is that there might be a divine dimension to it. And so I take those dimensions of ancient philosophy very seriously. But I think sort of if the question is, as it were, merely, whether in order to be motivated to seek the truth, one first must embrace a particular religion, I think my answer is probably not. I think what one needs to embrace is that it just really, truly matters whether you lead a good life or not. And then maybe it's sort of the second thought to say, well, why does that matter? Maybe part of why it matters to take care of one's soul, as Socrates would put this, is that the soul is sort of some kind of connection to divinity. But in a sense, that is then in this way of thinking the second step.
Yeah, I wonder if I can ask another question that sort of merges the traditions even more. I know one charge that sometimes is brought against Christianity, or maybe to the favor of Christianity, if you like Neoplatonism, is that, it's sort of you replace the form of the good with this divinely simple God or something like that. And then there are other things going on as well. And then, of course, in Christianity, you have timeless questions that are asked, like, what is truth, which is asked to Christ. And I was wondering from each of your perspectives, how exactly truth relates to the good. And I know that's like a very difficult question, perhaps. The good is difficult, just like the beautiful is difficult. But maybe starting with Katja, how you see truth and the value of truth relating to the good.
Yes, that is a big question. So I will say that insofar as I think that pretty much all truth seeking has something to do with how we should live, I think there is an immediate connection. Now, of course, there are going to be questions in, let's say, theoretical physics where the connection to how we should live is at least not apparent to me. But on the whole, I think that how we to understand the universe, to understand human beings, to understand the human mind and brain, to understand social dynamics, psychology, all of that, I think has a bearing on how we live. And so I think that fundamentally we seek the truth because we want to lead better lives. And that I think is a kind of direct connection to goodness. Now, does that mean that I have an account of goodness? On the kind of picture that I just described, goodness is at least determined as an end for us or a goal for us, something that we pursue. And I'm on board with that view. That is a kind of Aristotelian view, a view that also a lot of philosophers in later traditions hold, that whatever we do as human beings, for us to be motivated to do it, we need to somehow see it in a positive light. We need to see something good about it. Otherwise, we just wouldn't be motivated to do it. So I think that is a general claim about human agency, but also a claim about human inquiry.
I think Aristotle says famously, all men by nature desire to know. And this is the kind of thing that you could easily put on like an archway at a university or on a view book that you hand to freshmen. But I believe that this is true for some of the reasons Katja mentioned about care for the soul. Like it's just part of the same way human beings long for food and water, and we long to exercise our muscles. We long to know things. It's just like in our nature to want to know the answers to things. We're the only species that makes wordles and then tries to figure out the answers to them, even when we're not sure it's going to help us survive the winter. But there are challenges to this desire to know. And there are lots of ways we set up our social lives, the ways we set up universities, ways we set up religions that suppress that natural desire or make it harder. Katja brought up quantum mechanics. I think for those of us that live and work around colleges and universities right now and love these places, we do realize that half the time when we're presenting about our research or when we're trying to talk about our views with other people, we don't try to include them or think that they're entitled to know. I don't know of a lot of philosophy professors or physics professors or math professors who stay up at night thinking, I hope that Jonathan Tanaka will understand this proof that I just did. We think about the truth as something that belongs to an exclusive group, or it's something that's always going to be way too difficult and requires a lot of specialization. And it's not, the truth about all of these different disparate questions will never be accessible to just a single person who wants to seek it. And I think one of the interesting challenges for philosophers, this was true in the ancient world, it was true in the Lyceum, and it's definitely true at Notre Dame and at Columbia, is trying to wrestle with that. We're going after figuring out the answers and the truth about all of these different questions. But do we think at the end of the day that if we got the answers, they would come back together into something that's good for us or that's kind of meeting some deep human need? And I think that's a genuinely interesting question. We have to take seriously that asking all of these really specialized, difficult questions in all these different disciplines, it's really important, hard work. It's a lifetime's worth of work for some of my colleagues. But at the same time, somehow all of these different threads are going to come back together into something that has been meaningful for us as individuals or as humankind. All men by nature desire to know and then fill in the difficult thing somebody's working on. How that need is going to be satisfied, I think that's a philosophical question and a really interesting one.
Yeah, I don't know. I have another question, unless Katja, you have. Okay.
I want to say something about all men desire to know, all human beings desire to know. That is the first sentence of Aristotle's Metaphysics, as Meghan just said. I love that sentence, and I love to have a discussion in class about it, because usually I teach it when I teach a kind of ancient philosophy intro. And so we've just been reading a lot of Plato. And then I ask the students what they think. And of course, they sometimes know it because people, use that as a quote in speeches, at celebrations in universities and colleges. But at that point, when Aristotle says this, you can also read it as polemic against Socrates, because, you read these dialogues. Most people who are talking to Socrates are kind of, after a couple of exchanges, they are like, goodbye, like I've had enough.
They don't want to know.
We have seen a lot of examples at that point in the semester of people who are really fed up with this. And I just sort of seeing your poster or the corrupt the youth thing here, of course, kind of brings to mind Socrates. So I think this is not just something about, other people, about like some stupid interlocutor of Socrates who is not sufficiently invested in inquiry. I think this can affect all of us in different contexts, that sometimes one feels like, I'm not so sure that I need to know this, want to push further, and so on. And I think that's something to take seriously. Like, what exactly is this desire to know? It sounds really lofty and wonderful, but there's a lot of questions, I think, here that are interesting to discuss.
Just on this note, I mean, I'm a metaphysician in half of my life in philosophy. So half my life is teaching undergraduates about Plato and Aristotle, and the other half of my life is like modal logic. There are like 5 people on earth that read any of these papers or care at all about the topics. I love this part of Aristotle because Aristotle has just this crazy confidence in systematicity. He's like, we are going to find like the spots for all of these different parts of inquiry. And once they all fit together into the huge system, then you're going to see why you're really glad that this one little piece was functioning correctly. And I do sometimes wonder if we've also lost a bit of that hope. Like, desiring for truth is also having this kind of confidence that my little piece of what I'm able to contribute to knowing things on my brief time on planet Earth will fit into some big, meaningful network that I might not be able to appreciate, but the network is there. And that probably gave Aristotle some confidence. But some of that, is that still true? Or is the world just kind of complicated and messy and full of contradictions? In which case, there might be some things we we can't know or shouldn't want to know. And this is why philosophers should rule so that we can figure out the direction on such topics.
On that sort of note, before we get into some more of the audience questions, I was wondering if we could, talk about a question that's maybe slightly more practical for a lot of people who aren't going to be writing up systematic treatises in philosophy or theology or anything like that. How exactly might they live a life in accordance with the value of truth? Let's start with Meghan this time.
I think that building a commitment to truth into your like day-to-day ethical life is one of the greatest habits that we can work on, and it takes work. Well, here's how it kind of shows up in my life, and I'm not holding myself up as a paradigm of excellence on this, but think about the arguments that you have with people. I can think about a big argument I had with a friend about the COVID vaccines a few months ago. And we're sitting there and we're agreeing to have a conversation about it. And I come in come in pretty hot with my smart arguments and really pressuring him to see things a certain way, and really not unrelenting if he doesn't change his mind. And I do really believe that I know something that's important and relevant to the good life on this question. But it went disastrously. We had a big row, and our friendship kind of took a beating as a result. I know everybody's going through this with people in their lives right now. If it's not public health, it's politics, or it's about religion or some fraught topic. And one of the things I realized is the temptation is to blame the person who disagrees with you in these encounters when you have them. Just say like, well, if he was more open-minded, or if he'd been willing to care about the truth, then this wouldn't have happened. And I think being somebody that claims to really care about the truth, you also have to take some responsibility for your role in making the truth present in these really difficult circumstances. And some things might be over our head. Like you just might not be in a situation where you're able to reach across the political divide right now and engage constructively with somebody really different to you. But there are lots of times where we could try a little bit harder. One thing I could have done in that conversation is just genuinely try to listen and understand what mattered most to him before I came in trying to control what his views would be. To care about like him and the things that he might already know about this topic, even if I ultimately disagree, to want to know that about the particular person that I'm engaging with before I get into the big ethical, political, public health debate. And so I think one of the things that concern for the truth, one of the ways this can show up in our daily life is by willing to be curious about things that we're not always given the social signals or the personal confidence to be curious about. And being curious about people who are looking at the world really differently to you, while realizing that you still might strongly disagree with them at the end of it. This is something that can be cultivated. And we know some people who are way better at it than other people. I think philosophy professors tend to not be very good at this skill because we're so great at argument and rhetoric and so confident, but we could get better at it. And it's a way of serving others, but it also is a way of honoring your concern for the truth, just in a kind of sophisticated and long-term way.
Yeah, I think you said something really interesting here about not just wanting to learn about the views that your friend has, but also wanting to learn about him. And I've often thought that is a big holdup in disagreements that turn into fights, that it can often feel that people actually don't like the other person, or that there is a kind of lack of valuing and respecting the other person, not just the other view. And I think that is a distinction worth trying to make. You can be, I think, appreciation of people as who they are goes a long way in creating a different starting point for conversations. And I'll say something somewhat related to this. One of the things that I really love about teaching at Columbia is that we have such a diverse student body, and people sometimes say something that completely surprises me, and they have just grown up in quite different cultures, contexts, habits, practices, ways of thinking. And I think it's such a privilege to have those surprises as a part of my teaching life and to be able to learn from them. But I think I've sort of drawn a lesson from that, for, like, speaking to the things that Meghan just explained, that there are far more such surprises than one might suspect, and that just as it were going into, whether that's a classroom or a conversation or whatever it is, with a kind of appreciation just of all these people is going to make one a different listener. And then, I don't know, I found that to be quite important.
Okay, so I would like to push it one step further. So we opened up talking about skepsis and perhaps pursuing truth that way through an ongoing inquiry. I was wondering if there are less obvious perhaps or non-traditional ways of pursuing truth that way as well. And perhaps I'd like to go back to sort of the difference in traditions between the Christian tradition and perhaps the ancient tradition, where the Christian tradition sees Christ, the Logos, second person, as being the embodiment of truth, and thus emulating someone who a perfect person is to pursue truth in a certain sense. And perhaps there is some sort of parody case with the good in the ancient tradition, or of course, the word Logos is not directly. It doesn't come from John originally, so perhaps there's something there as well. So I was wondering, if there are non-traditional ways, and by that I mean ways that aren't related very explicitly to skepsis, that we might pursue the truth by emulation, perhaps.
I'm happy to jump in on this. It's a question I think about quite a bit, and most of the faculty that I engage with are not religious, certainly not Christian, and even don't even know that much about the tradition. So they're always surprised when I say that my Christianity influences my intellectual life and my scholarly life, or they hear that as being like, I'm only ever willing to worship or work on Catholic topics, which is not true. Most of the research that I do has nothing to do with Catholicism, but I approach a lot of these questions in a Catholic or Christian way. And to Katja's point about like loving the truth requires learning how to love other people. And this is kind of a learned skill. Some people are hard to love, or people who are very different to you, people who are strangers, people who seem to be just operating on a different planet. It's hard to be sympathetic with philosophers in the past who had really different starting points and assumptions. It's also sometimes hard to be sympathetic with students who seem to just be willing to defend the worst moral theories in class, or with colleagues who I think are doing the most narrow projects. But one of the sources that I draw on in my scholarly life, trying to pursue the truth, is realizing that I need help learning how to love things that are unfamiliar or different or difficult. And this is one of the major themes of the Gospels. If you actually get into the Christian tradition, every Mass is about love. The whole like overarching narrative about how people relate to God is learning to love something very, very different to you, or something transcendent, or learning how to look at something in a new and loving way. And that it's a skill that in Christian life you practice through like sacraments and through service to the poor and through things that tend to be kind of distant from university life. But in all of those activities and habits, you develop hopefully this capacity for love that's a difficult skill that then you're going to carry with you when it comes time to like love somebody in a difficult debate, or when it comes time to extend charity to Leibniz when you really don't understand what the heck he's talking about with the monads. And a lot of pursuit of the truth does require having the skill of love. And I think there are different ways clearly that people try to develop and cultivate this in their lives, but it is a major theme of the Christian way of life, and the subject of like constant contemplation and meditation in Christian life. And that can be something that also helps you just start to see the truth as something that's worth loving.
Katja, do you see there being any parallels perhaps in the ancient traditions? I'm thinking particularly of Logos, going all the way back to the pre-Socratics, but especially in Hellenistic philosophy, how that ties in certain ways to the good life living in accordance with the active principle.
I will mention Plato again. I know, you mentioned Hellenistic philosophy, and you know that I love Hellenistic philosophy, but the closest parallel, I think, to what Meghan was just saying is in Plato's Symposium. Plato is quite convinced that love is the strongest human motivation and really pervasive. It's the kind of motivation for the good that I mentioned before. He thinks can only be explained as love because it is so fervent, as he puts this. Like we don't just, prefer good over bad. We love the good. We do whatever we can for, our life to go better, or for the lives of our loved ones to go better, and so on. I've often thought that philosophers kind of make a fool of themselves when they try to talk about love, because it is this unbelievably big topic. If you try to realistically ask yourself what moves people in life, honestly, probably there's nothing that is at all close to love. Like what we do, how do you structure your day? What are you thinking about most of the time? Why do you do the things you're doing? Evidently, kind of, whether that is love for like a romantic partner, or love for your children, or love for your parents, or love of more broadly humankind, or love, in, I don't know, for your fellow citizens, or whatever it might be. I think the trouble is that it is so difficult to say anything kind of halfway clear and plausible about this. So philosophers kind of don't say anything about it. But that is, there's good reason for this, because you don't want to make a fool of yourself, but it's also a problem because it is not a realistic picture of human motivation if we try to account for everything that people do without, as it were, the elephant in the room. That is the biggest motivator. I think that Plato is right about that. I also think that Christianity is right about, if that is a claim that, and Meghan can correct me, if that is a claim that we can ascribe to Christian views, then I think that's right. And it is another thing that Meghan said is something that I would agree with. It is something to practice. It doesn't come just, and on that, I think even like major modern moral philosophers like Immanuel Kant agree that if you were to think of love just as some kind of emotion that you have or not, then let's be realistic. We all get exhausted. We all get tired. We all get impatient with other people and so on. That is not enough. So in order to relate to other people in the way we should, there is some kind of positive, caring attitude that we need to cultivate. And that also needs to sometimes, be reason guided and not just a question of, do I still have the energy to have, as it were, automatically have this emotion?
Okay, so there is now another question. This one, I think I know what's asking, but because I'm not 100% sure, I'm going to read it word for word, and it's from Jeffrey. And Jeffrey asks, well, the statement, quote, "my opinion is such and such," end quote, is a statement of truth. Is there a spot where the sentence is eating itself, and /or/but is such a thought useful in conversation? So I suppose the phraseology of it's my opinion that, or perhaps opining, how does that relate to intellectual humility? What place is there for that sort of phrase, that sort of sentiment in conversation and disagreement? Maybe Katja, if you'd be willing to start with this one.
I have to admit that I didn't fully understand kind of purely acoustically what you read out. If you could read it out again. I understood what you said after you read it out, but not.
Yes. Yeah, let me go back to it really fast. So Jeffrey says, the statement, quote, "my opinion is such and such," end quote, is a statement of truth. Is there a spot where the sentence is eating itself, and /or/but is such a thought useful in conversation?
One thought, I'm not quite, it's a great, I think there's an important point about philosophy of language that the questioner wants to make, which is not my field. But there's this interesting puzzle of like why we say things if we don't think they're true. So like I tell you, Katja, you should stop eating meat, but I don't think that's true. But you should stop eating meat, or meat is bad for you. Or, Jonathan, it's raining outside. I don't think that's true, but it's raining outside. Like, why are you saying it if you don't think it's true? Though, arguably one of the things we most often contribute to conversations with other people is sharing things that we deem to be true, or at least like close enough to the truth to be interesting to the other person. You don't have to be certain, but you got to think it's like, a fighting chance. And so to want to share something with somebody else under that mode, but then try to hedge and take it back right away, it feels very weird. And sometimes they'll like, it's my opinion that it's raining outside, or it's my opinion that you shouldn't eat meat. The like, it's my opinion. Is it meant to deflect like your confidence in the thing that I'm saying? Or is it meant to just tell you I really want to just share something about me. I don't want to share something about meat or the weather. It's a genuine puzzle. And I think that philosophers could do better to remind people that even opinions can be dangerous. Like if you think that just sharing that something is like, it's my opinion that insert means that you can't be blamed for having said something wrong, or that somebody shouldn't rely on the information that you've shared. It doesn't really work that way. Like the, in my opinion, qualifier is not going to protect the thing that you're adding to the conversation, because the mere fact of wanting to talk with other people is wanting to change their mind or add something to the conversation. So that might be a way of trying to think about what the questioner is wondering about. I'm sure there's some philosopher of language listening to this. It's like, oh my God, there's several books written about this very topic.
I'll add one thing to this. I think that sometimes when we say such a thing, we do just want to convey a state of mind. And I think that that can play like a role in a conversation. I also think that there's a kind of, maybe there's a further angle to this. So my mind also went like where Meghan's mind went first, but sort of adding to this, sometimes we don't recall all the reasons that we had to form an opinion. And for example, Anna Souza has been working on this, that, am I still entitled to say like my opinion, my belief about something, if I don't recall, all the justifications, all the information in light of which I formed this opinion. And I think that is a kind of context where legitimately one sometimes just as well reports, well, I have such and such an opinion. For me to now fully add that to the discussion, not just as sort of descriptively about my state of mind, but as that content as something that I'm defending, I would now have to go back to all the reasons. But maybe I don't recall all the reasons. And I actually think that that's a quite interesting and important component to the analysis of disagreement and what is dogmatism and so on, because it's just humanly impossible to constantly reconstruct all the reasons that you had for forming all the views that you have. Now, does that make you a dogmatist? Does that mean that you can only currently utter those beliefs that you have right now formed and all the reasons are in the front of your mind? Probably not. What is the cutoff and so on? I think those are things that come up really in real life, like when you have a fight with someone and you think, I don't know, maybe kind of a relative of like an older generation, you think they are just saying the things that they've said for 20 years. Well, maybe that is a complaint, but maybe it is not a complaint, because maybe you yourself are also saying things that you have thought about a couple of years ago. Now you have this view, you don't recall all the reasons, and so on. So I think that's a sort of really tricky and interesting question.
Great, thank you so much. That prompted a lot more questions, so I'm having to pick and choose here a little bit. So the next one is, how might we disentangle confidence in my belief versus holding truth as mine? So, for example, reducing conversations to psychology tricks, which Sullivan mentioned, or is confidence a bad disposition to hold in general? Is that fully graspable, or shall I read that again? That was also a long one.
I think it's graspable. Give it one more time. Give it to us one more time.
Sure. Yeah. How might we disentangle confidence in my belief and subsequently a motivation to convince versus holding the truth as mine? For example, reducing conversations to, quote, psychology tricks, as Sullivan mentioned. Or is confidence a bad disposition to hold in general?
Maybe one way of framing this question, which I think is really interesting, is, are there some like beliefs which we hold to be true or to reflect the truth, but we don't really want to convince anyone else of, or we wouldn't mind if we were the only ones that knew them? And that seems like there are definitely such beliefs. Like, I believe that my mother loves me, and that belief is a pretty rich and detailed belief that's based on a lot of interpersonal experience. But if I find out you guys don't believe that, I guess I'd be a little creeped out that you wouldn't trust me then when I tell you my mom loves me. But if I couldn't convince you, that would be okay. Because I'd be like, you guys just don't really get it. Like you're not part of this relationship. And so that's okay. Or like believing that like snowfall on a February morning is beautiful and transcendent. Like I might really believe that and hold it to be true. But I might not be able to convey to you what I'm thinking really when I reflect on that belief. I might just not have the words to kind of express what that means to me. And so if I couldn't convince you to love snow, that kind of makes sense given what the role that belief plays in my mental life, even though I believe that it's true and I didn't just make it up and it wasn't just a choice that I made to deem it to be true. It really is a discovery that I made, but I just can't share it. And I think there's got to be some aspects of our life of truth that are private and interior in that way.
Yeah, maybe adding something just on the notion of confidence. I think it's a really interesting notion just to introduce into this discussion. I think it is possible that one's level of confidence comes apart with one's ability to defend a view by argument. And of course, it's easy to then think, well, okay, then you should maybe give up that view if you don't have arguments and so on. But that doesn't seem to be always the way to go. Like sometimes let's say, I have great confidence. Yeah, let's say with Megan's example that my mom loves me. Can I fully defend this by argument? I don't know. Maybe this is just sort of also not the sort of thing for which we asked arguments. Maybe it is more experiential. But then if we think that such a thing could be more experiential, what is the cutoff? Is something else, if someone has confidence in the existence of God and they feel that they are being pushed in a discussion, what are your arguments? And they feel like they don't have all the arguments. Are they then in a kind of bind, or should they say, well, maybe that is also, what are the kinds of things where confidence can be based on a kind of experiential thing, or whatever the other modes may be other than arguments. So I think this is like a super interesting notion to introduce here. Okay, so here's another one. I wonder about the connection. I wonder about the connection about the connection. I wonder about the connection between the goal of coming to love that which is radically different from us and the fear that the pursuit of truth will uncover something really bad or scary. Is the latter equivalent to the fear that inquiry can uncover things that are unlovable? Or is it the fear that we'll find things we're unequipped to love?
This is like Megan's philosophical therapy on Zoom today. Like, I don't know. This is why I need you guys in my life, is because there's this tension between feeling like, love compels you to take risks and to want to know and to kind of want to open areas of inquiry and to want to pay attention to something that's strange and unfamiliar. That's, love when it's fully operational has this ability to kind of push us outside of ourselves. The Greek philosophers have really beautiful things to say about this, the capacity to kind of unself or change ourselves through love. But that is scary because you might really like yourself and your life that you currently live and your way of perceiving the world. And you might really not want to know. Here's a practical example of this. And again, maybe I'll regret having said this on the internet. I am so glad nobody told me 2 years ago how long the pandemic would last. I'm very grateful that I didn't know in March 2020 that it was going to take 2 years of kind of complicated, stressful adjustment to deal with the world that we were actually living in with respect to this crisis. It would have crushed me, I think. I don't know if I would have had the inner resources to believe that I could endure that long. I'm very glad that I didn't know the truth about COVID-19 2 years ago. I got kind of ready for it at various times, but if you asked me in March 2020, I would have been like, it'll be over by April. My life was made so happy by believing this falsehood. we're like that with some things. Like Augustine says this, I think, quite beautifully in the Confessions. He reports how he's glad he didn't get like Christianity till kind of later in life, and that he got Plato first, and that he had this, series of experiences of learning things that kind of prepared him for some big bombs to get dropped on his life. And I think that is true as well with love compels us to curiosity and to want to get outside of where we're comfortable. But if it happens too fast or in the wrong order, or if our other virtues are not quite ready, and then the truth gets put on us all at once, it could hurt us, like creatures like us. Sometimes knowing things in the wrong time can be really difficult because of what else is going on with our lives. And I think this is a tension. That's why, when you say all men by nature desire to know, that is a bit of a provocative, kind of scary claim, because, do they? Is it going to be good for them, for that particular person? And I think this is something we have to wrestle with. But again, I feel like I'm also just getting my therapy, like my COVID therapy with you guys online. Maybe you think it's way easier.
Do you have a response in particular to that, Katja, or shall we move on to something else?
Are there some things you wish you didn't know?
Yeah.
I want to know the next question.
No, fair enough.
Okay, no worries. So, I was wondering, so I think, people have this question about, I guess, going full circle a little bit. So Katja opened a little bit in talking about some of the options when we are faced with disagreement and the value of truth that we have before us. And one that we might see as an adjacent sort of value that we have is this value of pluralism, or at least it seems that we have a value to some sort of restricted form of pluralism in like a broadly Western context, but also there in other contexts as well. And so I suppose that one question here is, what exactly is the ground of that sort of value? What is the value of pluralism? Would it be better if everyone knew the truth, but there was a sort of uniformity? What else is accomplished by valuing, to an extent, a type of pluralism?
Should I go first?
Sure.
That is, that's something I care about a lot. I think from the point of view of the type of theory I defend in my work, but that is greatly inspired by Aristotle and Plato. I think there just really would not be uniformity, because people are different. People and times and situations are different. So what is the right thing to do, or a good way to live, or the right set of values for a given person, the right set of pursuits for a given person, is going to be about who they are, in what situation they find themselves, and so on and so forth. And I think one thing that's important here is that I think is a real insight. I think there are more valuable things than fit into any one life. And that can be disappointing. Like, say, I cannot be an epidemiologist and a specialist in ancient philosophy and whatever. So there are, I think that both of these things and a lot of other things are greatly valuable. But by pursuing one thing, I have to sort of live with the fact that there are going to be other values that I'm not pursuing. Now, that does not mean that I don't acknowledge that they are valuable. And sometimes people make a distinction between judging something to be valuable, and I can judge a lot of things to be valuable, versus actually actively valuing them in the sense that I myself pursue them in my life. And I cannot pursue like a million things. I can pursue a certain set of things which somehow need to be compatible with each other. So I think that kind of picture can initially just seem like, you're not really speaking to the hard questions of pluralism, because, the fact that someone is a doctor and someone is like a philosophy teacher or whatever, that isn't really the problem. But I think the picture actually ultimately captures a lot of different values. It can capture different religious ways of life or non-religious ways of life. It can capture, for example, people deciding that they put their family first, or that they put some intellectual pursuit first. It can capture like devoting your life to art versus devoting your life to charity versus or helping other people, politics, and so on. And I think embedded in those kinds of pursuits are values that are difficult to kind of weigh against each other, and that somehow are just sort of each of them too important to just be. They are not just going to be this like little thing, so somehow all of them fit into one picture. Rather, once you devote your life, let's say, to such and such a project, it is like you can only really devote your life to this if it becomes to some extent somewhat consuming. So then that means that there are going to be other values that you don't pursue. But I think the important thing, and really also the important thing for disagreement, is that doesn't mean that one doesn't judge them to be valuable. Like someone can, for example, judge some religion to be valuable that they even don't know so much about. But they see that those people who live according to that religion lead one kind of good human life. And that kind of insight that there are several ways to lead good human lives, I think this is so extraordinarily important for preventing fights to become deadly.
Sure. I think I absolutely agree with what Katja said. And I think to just add to this, if you think about loving the truth as a virtue that you're trying like to build into your life, one of the things that we know about the virtues that I get from reading Plato and Aristotle is this kind of exercise analogy. Like if you want to build up this trait in yourself, you've got to work on it in the right order and the right progressions, and you've got to try it out in different contexts. Like the courage to go down a fast water slide is different from the courage to go into battle, is different from the courage to tell somebody a hard truth, but it's still courage. It just has to be tested in these different contexts to become like full-blown courage. And I think with the truth and pluralism, it's easy to think you've got the truth, or you have a pretty weak love of the truth if it never gets tested, if it never finds itself, you find yourself reasoning in unfamiliar contexts. But to really build up this skill in yourself, you've got to cross train. Like you've got to say that you're a critical thinker when you read the New York Times, and you're also a critical thinker when you read the National Review. And it's the same kind of underlying virtue that's tested with different inputs and in different environments, and grows over time as a result of that. And so if you're in a really homogenous community, I don't think you will ever really understand justice. Like if you never have any exposure to people who've been the subjects of all of the different ways that injustice manifests, and you claim to care about the truth of these questions, you're missing out on the opportunity to build up your understanding. Or if you always find yourself the smartest person in every room that you're in, or always an expert on whatever subject you're speaking on, you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. And you should be in contexts where you don't feel like the expert, or you don't enjoy that privilege, because that's how this muscle is going to grow. And this is partly this assumption that we're really far. We have a lot of room to grow on this front. Like, this gets into this question of intellectual humility, this idea that I might really care about the truth, and I might even have it in my head, the goal of the kind of truth I'd like to get to in my life. But to build up the virtue that's going to get me to that goal, I've got to be around different environments, and I've got to develop that disposition with it being tested in different ways, and allow those new environments and people to change me.
Yes, thank you so much. Okay, one final question, and it's apt, I think, that we finish on this idea culminating towards love. So this is, I guess this doesn't have a name, anonymous question asker here. How do we factor in this exercise of learning to love even those who may be fundamentally different to us in a political or social sphere context, taking a rather Machiavellian political viewpoint, of which at first glance doesn't seem to stem from love, but rather wanting to be loved while not loving? Perhaps, shall I read that one more time? Or? No, you've got it, Katja. Okay.
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think it is much easier to love other people if you've had that experience of being loved. And in philosophy, some philosophers work on whether there is a right to be loved for children. And I've been quite interested in that discussion because I actually am tempted to think that it is difficult to ask people to be loving if they haven't had that kind of experience growing up. I think it is so fundamental for human psychology, for just developing as a person, to be loved as a child, as an infant and as a child, that this becomes almost a kind of enabling condition for the ability to love other people. So I think the questioner is hitting upon a really important idea here, that just being required to do X, if you haven't grown up in conditions that are at least somewhat favorable to that, and where the idea is that, we often talk about material conditions that are very important for infants, and of course that is also extremely important. But the question of how children truly depend on being loved, I think is an interesting question in political philosophy, in psychology, but then also ultimately in ethics.
Do you have any response, Meghan, or perhaps closing thoughts, as this is the last question?
I mean, it gets into one of these just foundational questions in normative theory, which is how much, what good things do we have personal agency and responsibility, and which things do we really depend on structures being a certain way? I was thinking about this. I was talking with another undergraduate this morning who's working on a paper about rights to relationships for her final project, and thinking about for people who are who don't experience love or who don't have relationships, important relationships extended to them. Should we, as people who live around such folks, feel a strong sense of personal obligation to step in and try to extend love and relationships to those individuals? Or at the end of the day, is this problem that lies at the feet of society? Like, we think we shouldn't have created society such that people are excluded in these ways, but no particular member of society is responsible for that or should feel a sense of personal responsibility for it. And I think this is it's one of the most important questions we face when we say we care about love and justice and these other really morally significant features being present in our world. So I don't have much to add to that, except my gosh, I spent between 8 and 9:45 a.m. this morning getting increasingly frustrated at my inability to say something meaningful to this student as she's trying to finish her paper. And I think it's something that we have to think about. And maybe just to get back to the central theme of this dialogue, with respect to truth, is pursuit of the truth something an individual can kind of manifest in her life? So the truth is going to rule over my life. I'm going to take a lot of agency over my intellectual life. Or is caring about the truth the kind of thing that we're really dependent on being in a good society, having access to great education, having access to a free press and a good democracy and not a corrupt democracy? We might worry that actually if truth is a great good in our lives, we might not have a ton of personal control over getting that good. We might be deeply dependent on other people, and so want to pay really close attention to the kinds of systems and structures that we live in, because that might be what ultimately determines whether or not we as individuals ever get satisfaction.